I'm here with Jason Crandall, the pastor of Cityview Church in Pearland, and also the church planting strategist with the SBTC convention. So Jason, let's talk about how you instilled a sending culture in your church plant while it was still very young. How did you do that?
Sure. So it really began early, even before we launched. So we had been praying through, God, what do you want us to do with a church plant? And a conviction of ours was that we didn't just want to be a church that grew big in our city, but we wanted to be a church that multiplied throughout the greater city of Houston. We felt like adding wasn't necessarily the best thing for the kingdom, but to think more multiplication strategy. So from even before we started the church, we were praying that God would bring us somebody to be on staff with us that could learn from us and then would plant out from us. That guy was Pearland. So in 2013, I went to go see him. I was preaching at a Disciple Now for his church in Missouri, and shared with him what God was laying on my heart, that we would plant a church that was pregnant, a church that was ready to multiply quickly soon after launch. And so he prayed through that, and through the course of about 3 months, he and I had lots of conversations, and then he moved to start working with us in the summer of 2013. Cityview launched publicly February of 2014. And that day that we launched publicly, we shared with our whole church, hey, 18 months from now, Lord willing, we're going to be planting a church. Pearland is going to be the pastor of that church, and we're not exactly sure where it's going to be at or who's going to go, but we're asking people to consider from the very, very beginning that they would go. On top of that, we didn't just want to have an idea or a strategy, but we wanted to put our money where our mouth was. So from the very beginning, Cityview's put aside at least 5% of our regular tithes and offerings for the purpose of church planting. So that money would go directly to church planters to go out the door so they can start off well.
So you launched with a church planter already part of that launch team. And I heard you say plant pregnant. Is that a part of your strategy going forward for all of your church plants?
We kind of do that as the Lord allows. One of our plants did plant pregnant as well. We're excited to see how that's going to turn out. It's not a requirement to plant with us, but it's definitely something we would like to see. And the term planting pregnant just means that we're starting a church, but we already have another church planter ready to go soon after we launch, so that we can reinforce in the minds of our people that church planting is going to be a gigantic aspect of what we do.
So some people might be curious about how big your church is. So let's get that out of the way. How big is your church?
So Cityview, as it's constituted, we have about 200 regular attenders. That they never show up at the same time.
Sure.
We average about 150, 160 people a week. When we planted when we planted that first church, we had 110 people the week before we sent he and his team. We sent he and his team, so Carrie and 25 other people, to go plant from us that next week.
And how do you react when people say, well, my church isn't big enough to get involved with church planting? I mean, you started small or a normal sized church, and then you planted immediately. You're 5 years in, your church has led to planting 5 churches in that 5 years. How do you react to that?
Like, I understand the feeling, but I say you can't outgive God. So we sent 110, we had 110 people. We sent 25 people to go plant Cityview Alvin. So 110 minus 25, that equals 85 people, right? So that's what we would expect coming back the next week. Well, the next week, Cityview had 130 people. And so for us, it illustrated to us in that 1 week that the idea that you just can't outgive God, that we're going to give away and God's going to replenish in greater ways. Additionally, $5,000 a month in tithing went out the door, which is a gigantic amount for a church plant, you know? But that next quarter, after that $5,000 a month was out the door, was our greatest giving quarter that we've ever experienced. And so the Lord just continued to show us over and over again, you can't outgive God, you can't outgive me. For the sake of multiplication, for the sake of the gospel going out, don't be afraid.
So you wrote a book about how normal-sized churches can be involved in planting and multiplication. So tell us about that book. Tell us about where we can learn more about Cityview Church.
Right on. So I wrote the book called Proliferate. The idea of Proliferate is developing a church planting strategy for everyday churches. Something like 85% of churches are 200 in attendance or lower. Cityview falls there. Most churches I know fall there. And the idea is that if those 85% of churches aren't engaged in church planting, then we're losing a gigantic number of believers and churches that are not being engaged in church planting, not being engaged in gospel multiplication. And so I wrote that book in order to say, hey, develop a strategy. Maybe your church needs to multiply. Maybe your church just needs to figure out a way to be involved in multiplication. But every church should be involved in multiplication in one way or another. Whether they're large or small, whether they've got a huge budget or a small budget, even whether they're healthy or not healthy, they should be involved in multiplication. They don't all multiply the same way. They don't all get involved in the same way. But that they should find a way towards multiplication. And in that, they might find health.
All right. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.